Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining this live stream. And this essay I'd like to talk about is the West and Western democracy a failed social experiment, experiment in governance and societal organisation. It certainly looks like it today. It seems to be, everywhere we look, it seems to be falling apart. Every aspect of democracy, the rule of law, due legal process, seems to be under assault from all sides. So it's quite reasonable to assume that it's an experiment that failed. So let's just go back a little bit in time and have a look at how democracy, as we understand it today, began, and where it seems to be heading. And I should add, before getting there, that universal franchise, that is, where everyone gets the vote, men and women get the vote, is less than 100 years old. So it's, in historical terms, there's only been a very short space of time that we've had universal franchise, where the entire population adult population gets the right to vote. Now, prior to that, democracy that didn't occur, or it occurred in a few places, or it's very limited. Maybe less than 5% of the population got to vote. In some cases, even less than that. In some situations, you'd have a king or a monarch with maybe a council of 100 or so of the aristocrats, and that would be the governing body. And they weren't selected through any sort of electoral process. So democracy as universal franchise has a very short time span. Now, after, say, even, this is in about 1920, 1922, even 50 years, less than 50 years, not 50 years after universal franchise came in, what we would call today the deep state, or the globalists, or the early iterations of them, they already wanted to get rid of it. They already thought that it just wasn't working. They couldn't get what they wanted. They resented the proportion of national wealth that went to the workers. They didn't think the workers should have the vote. And so already they were conspiring back then to what we would call shut down the political market, and to make sure that all the major political parties were pushing the same policies, and that they were owned, if you like, by the big conglomerates, which is pretty much where we are today. So this is how it was say in 1968, 1969, they already wanted to get rid of universal franchise. Now, I should point out, how did universal franchise come about? Even at around the 1880s, the voting structure that we sort of understand more or less today it worked into its final stages. Say 65% or thereabouts of men had the vote, and 10 to 15% of women, and that was about the optimum. That's where it had reached its maximum point, where those with the most skin in the game and the most responsibility in society had the biggest say. Now that all changed when the entire economy mobilized for total industrial war in World War I, and then again in World War II. These sacrifices, whether it was women in the workforce or whether it was men laying their lives down in the battlefield, this was considered that these sacrifices must allow them to have some sort of say in government and some sort of say in how the country was run. And this is where universal franchise came from, these sorts of things, and indeed the welfare state sort of came from this. Now, technology, it was viewed in the Cold War that there would be another mass mobilization of the nation's resources to fight another war. This is against the Russians and so on during the Cold War, against the Soviet Union during the Cold War. That war never took place, or certainly not to the point of mass mobilization. There was still the draft for, say, the Vietnam War in the United States, but that wasn't a mass mobilization thing. I think at its high point, something like 500,000 or so US troops were in Vietnam, unlike well over 10 million in World War II, for example. So this idea of laying one's life down for the state, for the nation, that no longer applied. The wars of the future, and particularly after 1990, the wars of the future were going to be very technical wars. They were going to be done at long range through electronics, and of course now in cyberspace and so on. So it was seen that the plebs, the hoi polloi, the peasants, they weren't going to be needed to lay their lives down for to protect the nation and protect the interests of the ruling class. So why should they have the vote there, and why should they have so much of the nation's wealth? Now, there was a really big scare during the time of the Soviet era, when the Soviets were putting forward arguments that they had a much better system than capitalism, and capitalism still had a sort of a crisis of confidence that came about from the Depression, and that the West hadn't really recovered from that. So they were kind of scared that the Soviets in their communist economy might have had an attractive siren call to a lot of the working class people in the West. So it was agreed that the working class would have a bigger proportion of the total wealth pie of the West, and this was reflected in higher wages and so on. So when the threat of communism went, two things occurred. One, we don't need these peasants to fight wars for us. It's all going to be technical and smaller, high-tech teams type thing. And why should they have so much of the national wealth pie if we don't need them anymore? And there's no communism for them to go running to, or to as a basis for any sort of revolution. They got nowhere to go, so they've got to accept whatever we allow them to have. And that's when the size of the pie that went to the workers declined, and it declined quite substantially. And also on the other side, there was inflation in key areas that suited the elites, such as real estate and share market appreciation, those things. That all suited the elites. But in the case of, say, real estate and the essentials of life, things like food, water, energy, and power, those things all started to increase in price as well beyond the inflation of the paycheck. So this indicates that we don't need you anymore, is what the elites are saying here. You're now irrelevant to us. We don't need you to fight our wars, or certainly not in large quantities. And because communism is no longer a possible attraction to you, we don't care whether you like capitalism or not. You've got nowhere else to go, and so you're going to get a smaller portion of the pie. So both these things occurred. The third thing to occur was that the globalists were successful in getting all the major parties to pursue the same policies. They all, for example, today, they all support mass migration and so on. So all the globalist policies are supported by all the Western governments and all the major parties in the West. So including all the major institutions, by the way, as well. So these things all undermine the purpose and point and the very function of democracy. Democracy is where the people get to decide their government and who represents them. The way it's meant to work is each community or each area selects somebody who lives there, who's always lived there, who they know, who everybody knows, and then that person gets sent to the Parliament or the Congress to represent the interests of that locale. Now that's gone away. Party machines now pick the people they want to parachute into the Parliament. People like AOC and Ayanna Presley and Ilhan Omar, and the list just goes on of people. Maisie Hirono, people that you wouldn't employ in a takeout chicken shop, for goodness sakes, and they're all in federal parliaments, and it's the same around the Western world. Some of the lowest quality, lowest IQ people you can imagine are being put into parliament because they're not required to do a job. They just got to vote the way they're told to vote, and they get given a lot of overseas trips and a lot of fancy stuff that they couldn't dream of couldn't dream of, unless they were given this sort of patronage. But this brings us back to the function of democracy. Once you take away that concept of representation, once you take away the idea of different parliament, different political groups in parliament offering the people different solutions. For example, if any major party got up in the West today and said, look, we're going to stop this migration. It's bullshit. It's lowering your wages. It's lowering your standard of living. English is barely spoken, or wherever the country is, German or French is barely spoken in a third of the country. We're going to put a stop to this bullshit. If people want to stay, they've got to show continuous employment, and they've got to show that they can speak the local language competently. They've got to show that they want to assimilate and integrate. And if they can't do any or all of those things, then they're going back to wherever they came from, or back to the nearest country of origin in terms of their culture or their religion or so on. Now, if any Western government to do that, they'd win in an absolute landslide. They would win in a huge landslide, and the globalists know this, and so this is why they have to shut down the political market and have all the major parties on the same page. But coming back to democracy as a failed experiment, this sort of degree of control that the globalists are now exercising across all facets of life in the West, this degree of control means that democracy and the idea of people voting for the government is no longer of any use to the people that make the decisions, the globalists. So are we transitioning to something else? Is democracy going to be given up as something that never really worked or didn't work for the people that really want to run things? Or will something else come out of this? Will there be something that's tantamount to revolution, for example, and we head down a different path? If we look at someone like Noam Chomsky as an example in Manufacturing Consent, and some of his other works has suggested that less than 1 in 4 people in America, I think he's referring to, are able to grasp the civic, socio-political issues that are going around the country at any one time, and therefore they're the only ones that should really have the right to vote. Now, they tend to be the better off and the better educated, the better informed, people who have the time to do it, and these sorts of things. So maybe we end up with something along those lines, that there's only 20%, 25%, somewhere around there, of the population gets to vote, and they decide the government, and then maybe people who lay their lives down, such as frontline military personnel or maybe frontline firefighters and so on, I think people that are prepared to put their life on the line for the benefit of the community, I think they should have the right to vote. So maybe those people, but that's still not going to, that still wouldn't even come to a third of the total adult population. Now, we can look at other things. Maybe people under the age of 25 shouldn't have the right to vote. Maybe people who I think we can do it in education, because any standard that's put in place, such as only people who have got a good education can vote, then we can see all these black lesbians, or they have triple PhDs. So there'll be those that'll deliberately bastardize any sort of impartial, independent bar, and then change that into some sort of social justice nonsense. But at the moment, that's only being used to undermine the democracy itself and the function of democracy and the civic responsibilities around the democracy. So until we reach a stage where we can revisit the concept of civic responsibility, who should reasonably have the right to vote and make an informed voting decision, and we can accept that there's plenty of people that can't do that, then does democracy need to be rebuilt as still a representative democracy, where the better informed people do get the right to vote? Now, who gets to decide who's better informed? There are a lot of civic issues to deal with here, but the important thing is democracy developed organically over time, and particularly in industrial societies where wealth dispersed and distributed. And industrial societies created that dispersal of wealth, which in turn created a situation where many, many people had a stake in society and thus wanted the vote, and it was reasonable to give it to them. As the wealth dispersal declines, and increasingly there's only going to be not less than 1% are going to have any decent amount of wealth, certainly the way things are heading, then that in turn directly impacts democracy, because if so few people are able to make enough money to live what you would call a middle class lifestyle, then their interest in voting, and as the elites would see it, why the fuck should they get the vote? They can barely feed themselves. Why should they get the right to tell us what should and shouldn't happen in government? There are a number of forces moving in different directions, colliding with one another, and the end result is this has to shake out before we can see the new version of democracy come out, assuming that's where it goes. My preference would be for the globalists to accept now that what they want to do isn't working and hasn't worked, and their propensity to accept vast amounts of collateral damage in pursuit of an objective that they're not going to get in the end. They should back off, stop that, and we sit down around a table and we talk about a way forward that maybe does involve a reduced form of democracy. For example, people under the age of unless they serve in the military and in frontline positions, people under the age of 25 maybe shouldn't have the vote. I don't know. I'm putting forward ideas here, but in order to restrict the vote to the best informed and with the most skin in the game, then we maybe do need to revisit this, which will then sate the appetite of the globalists for their clear and utter sneering contempt for the people at the bottom. That these were the people that years ago would have been drafted in to fight the wars, and they needed them then. And they also needed them to keep their heads turned away from communism. But now they don't need them, and the elites treat these people like shit. And that's maybe part of the problem for the democratic process. So a whole lot of things to think about there, a whole lot of things to address. But what are your ideas? Put your comments below, because I think either way, whether it's today, tomorrow, next few years, this is going to need to be addressed, and hopefully it can be addressed without resort to deadly confrontation with one suspects cannot be ruled out. You've been with Tassus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.